I thought I was going on a routine fishing trip that would last 3 days instead. I spent over 2 years floating in a tiny life raft, watching my fishing partner die of dehydration, battling sharks, and slowly losing my grip on reality, as the endless Pacific Ocean became both my prison and my home. But the most terrifying part wasn't the hunger, the storms, or even the hallucinations. It was the moment I realized that surviving might be worse than dying. And that's when I had to make an impossible choice that would haunt me forever. What would you do if rescue finally came, but you were no longer sure you wanted to be saved? The horrifying story of the man who survived 756 days on the OCE. The morning of September 12th, 2019, dawned crisp and clear over the Pacific coast of Mexico. Miguel Ramirez stood on the dock at Puerto Vallarta, breathing in the salt air that had been his companion for over 30 years. At 52, Miguel had weathered more storms than most sailors twice his age, his weathered hands telling stories of countless nets hauled from the depths and battles won against the sea's fury. "Another beautiful day, eh, Miguel?" called out Carlos, his fishing partner for the past decade. The younger man was already loading their modest 20-foot fiberglass boat with supplies for what they anticipated would be a routine 3-day fishing expedition. Miguel nodded, his dark eyes scanning the horizon where the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the setting sun. Something felt different about this morning. Not wrong exactly, but charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the way the seabirds circled higher than usual, or how the water seemed to shimmer with an almost supernatural clarity. "The yellowfin are running deep this season," Miguel said, securing the last of their fishing gear. "We'll need to go farther out than usual." Their boat, the Santa Maria, was well maintained but aging. Miguel had purchased her 15 years earlier with his life savings, and she had served him faithfully through hundreds of expeditions. Her hull bore the scars of encounters with rough seas, and her engine occasionally protested with coughs and sputters, but she had never failed to bring him home. As they motored out of the harbor, Miguel's wife Elena waved from the pier, her silhouette growing smaller until it vanished entirely. He touched the silver cross hanging from his neck, a gift from Elena on their wedding day, 26 years ago, and whispered a quiet prayer for safe passage, as he had done every morning for 3 decades. The first 2 days passed without incident. They found a promising spot roughly 60 miles offshore, where the continental shelf dropped into the abyss and the water turned from turquoise to deep indigo. The yellowfin tuna were indeed running deep, requiring them to venture even farther from shore than Miguel had initially planned. By the evening of September 13th, they were nearly 80 miles from Puerto Vallarta, farther than Miguel had ever fished in his modest vessel. But the catch had been extraordinary. Their hold was nearly full, with premium yellowfin that would fetch top dollar at the morning market. "We should head back," Carlos said, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "This is far enough for the Santa Maria." Miguel studied the sky. Years of reading weather patterns had taught him to interpret the subtle signs that escaped less experienced fishermen. The clouds on the western horizon held an ominous thickness, and the wind had begun shifting in ways that made his stomach tighten with unease. "You're right," he said, starting the engine. "We'll run through the night. I don't like the look of that weather system moving in." But the Santa Maria had other plans. 20 minutes into their journey home, the engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. Miguel tried repeatedly to restart it, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the pull cord. Each attempt yielded only silence. "The fuel line," Carlos said after they'd spent an hour diagnosing the problem in the dying light. "It's completely corroded. We won't be able to fix this without replacement parts." Miguel stared at the useless engine, then at the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. In 30 years of fishing, he had encountered engine problems before, but never this far from shore, with weather approaching. "The radio," he said, moving to their emergency communication device. But when he powered it on, only static filled the speakers. The antenna had been damaged during their last expedition, and Miguel had postponed repairs, never imagining they would venture so far from land. As the first drops of rain began to fall, both men realized the gravity of their situation. They were 80 miles from shore in a disabled boat, with no means of communication, and the storm approaching from the west promised to be severe. "We have emergency flares," Carlos said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "And the life raft." Miguel nodded grimly. They had perhaps an hour before the storm reached them in full force. He quickly inventoried their supplies. 12 gallons of fresh water, enough dried fish and provisions for a week, basic fishing equipment, a tarp, some rope, and a small medical kit. It wasn't much, but it was something. The storm struck with a violence that defied Miguel's worst fears. Waves 20 feet high lifted the Santa Maria like a toy, hurling her through valleys of black water before slamming her down with bone-jarring force. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, turning the air itself into water. For 18 hours, Miguel and Carlos fought to keep their boat afloat. They bailed water constantly, their hands raw and bleeding from gripping the bucket handles. The engine compartment flooded despite their efforts, and by dawn on September 15th, the Santa Maria was riding dangerously low in the water. "She's taking on too much water," Miguel shouted over the howling wind. "We need to deploy the life raft." The decision to abandon ship was perhaps the most difficult of Miguel's life. The Santa Maria had been more than a boat. She had been his livelihood, his sanctuary, his connection to a life he loved. But as another massive wave crashed over her deck, nearly washing Carlos overboard, Miguel knew they had no choice. They deployed the 4-person life raft, just as the Santa Maria began her final plunge toward the ocean floor. Miguel watched his life's work disappear beneath the churning surface, taking with it not just their means of propulsion but their shelter, their equipment, and most of their supplies. What they managed to save fit into 2 waterproof bags, 4 gallons of fresh water, dried fish and crackers sufficient for perhaps 4 days, their fishing lines and hooks, the medical kit, and a few personal items. Miguel clutched his wife's photograph, protected in a plastic sleeve, and his silver cross. The life raft, designed for coastal emergencies, proved woefully inadequate for the open ocean. It leaked constantly, requiring them to bail water every few hours. The canopy provided minimal protection from the sun and none from the larger waves that regularly washed over them. On their 3rd day adrift, Carlos spotted a merchant vessel on the horizon. They fired 2 of their 3 emergency flares, watching desperately as the orange smoke dissipated in the wind. The ship continued on its course, unaware of their presence. "They didn't see us," Carlos said, his voice hollow with despair. That night, as they huddled together in the cramped raft, Carlos began to speak of his family, his pregnant wife, his 2 young daughters, his dreams of opening his own restaurant. Miguel listened, sharing his own memories of Elena, their failed attempts to have children, the fishing trips that had defined their life together. By the 5th day, their water was nearly gone. They had been rationing it carefully, allowing themselves only small sips twice daily. But the Pacific sun was merciless. Their lips cracked and bled, their tongues swelled, and the constant motion of the raft made it nearly impossible to sleep. Carlos began showing signs of severe dehydration on the 6th day. His speech became slurred, his movements erratic. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, he began hallucinating. "Maria," he called out to the empty ocean. "Maria, I'm coming home." Miguel held his friend's hand as Carlos's breathing grew shallow and labored. By dawn on September 20, their 7th day adrift, Carlos Mendoza had died, his body finally succumbing to dehydration and exposure. Miguel stared at his friend's lifeless form, the magnitude of his isolation crashing over him like the waves that had claimed the Santa Maria. He was alone now, truly alone, in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. The decision of what to do with Carlos's body tormented Miguel for hours. Every instinct screamed against committing his friend to the deep, but the practical reality was inescapable. The body would decompose rapidly in the tropical heat, posing a health risk and attracting predators. With tears streaming down his salt-crusted cheeks, Miguel said a prayer for Carlos's soul and gently lowered his friend's body into the water. He watched until the ocean claimed it completely, then sat in stunned silence as the full weight of his solitude settled upon him. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of sun, thirst, and desperate hope. Miguel rationed his remaining water drop by precious drop, allowing himself only enough to wet his lips twice daily. He caught rainwater when possible, using the tarp as a collection system, but the brief tropical squalls provided precious little relief. Hunger became his constant companion. The dried fish was gone within 2 weeks, leaving Miguel dependent on whatever he could catch from the raft. With infinite patience born of desperation, he learned to fish with his bare hands, catching small fish and eating them raw, bones and all. The taste was revolting, but it provided essential nutrients and, more importantly, precious fluids. As September turned to October, Miguel began experiencing the first signs of prolonged isolation. He talked to himself constantly, carrying on conversations with Elena, with Carlos, with his long-dead father. Sometimes he forgot they weren't actually present in the raft with him. The hallucinations began during his third week adrift. At first, they were benign. He would see ships on the horizon that weren't there, or imagine he could smell his wife's cooking on the wind. But as his physical condition deteriorated, the visions became more disturbing. He began seeing Carlos sitting across from him in the raft, engaged in animated conversation about their families, their dreams, their fears. For hours at a time, Miguel would forget his friend was dead, only to have reality crash back when he reached out to touch him and found only empty air. The sun became his greatest enemy. During the day, temperatures in the raft regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin canopy provided minimal shade, and the reflection of sunlight off the water created a furnace-like environment that sapped his strength and sanity. Miguel's skin blistered and peeled, his body becoming a patchwork of raw, sunburned flesh. But the nights brought their own terrors. Without the sun's warmth, temperatures plummeted, leaving Miguel shivering uncontrollably in his salt-stained clothes. Worse were the sounds: the endless slap of waves against the raft, the creaking of the rubber hull, and, occasionally, the splash of large marine life investigating their small craft. On his 30th day adrift, Miguel encountered his first shark. He awoke to find a 12-foot tiger shark circling the raft, its massive form clearly visible through the clear tropical water. For 3 hours, it remained nearby, occasionally bumping the raft's hull with enough force to nearly tip Miguel into the water. Terror paralyzed him. He sat motionless in the center of the raft, barely breathing, as the apex predator evaluated this strange floating object. Finally, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shark vanished into the blue depths, leaving Miguel shaking with adrenaline and relief. As October gave way to November, Miguel's body began showing severe signs of malnutrition. His weight dropped dramatically. He estimated he had lost nearly 60 pounds from his already lean frame. His muscles atrophied, his hair began falling out, and his vision grew increasingly blurry. But it was the psychological deterioration that proved most challenging. The isolation played tricks with his mind, creating elaborate fantasies and delusions. Sometimes he believed he was back home in Puerto Vallarta, helping Elena prepare dinner. Other times, he was a child again, fishing with his father in the coastal lagoons near their village. The boundaries between reality and hallucination became increasingly blurred. Miguel found himself holding entire conversations with people who weren't there, becoming angry when they didn't respond appropriately to his questions. He began keeping a mental diary, marking each day by scratching lines into the raft's floor with a fishhook. But even this became unreliable as his grip on time and reality weakened. During his second month adrift, Miguel experienced what he later described as his dark night of the soul. A severe storm had battered the raft for 3 days, leaving him hypothermic, dehydrated, and spiritually broken. As he lay in the waterlogged raft, barely conscious, he felt his will to live ebbing away. "Elena," he whispered to the storm-tossed sky, "I'm sorry. I can't make it home." But even as despair threatened to claim him, something deep within Miguel's spirit rebelled against surrender. Perhaps it was the memory of Elena's smile, or his father's lessons about the strength required to survive at sea, or simply the stubborn determination that had carried him through 5 decades of life. Whatever its source, this inner flame refused to be extinguished. Miguel forced himself to sit up, to bail the water from the raft, to continue the endless routine of survival that had become his existence. He wouldn't die easily. He wouldn't abandon the hope of seeing his wife's face again. The months that followed established a grim routine. Miguel's days revolved around the basics of survival: collecting rainwater, fishing, bailing out the raft, and protecting himself from the sun's brutal assault. He became expert at reading weather patterns, able to predict storms hours before they arrived, based on subtle changes in wind direction and cloud formation. His body adapted to the harsh conditions in remarkable ways, His hands developed thick calluses that protected them from the constant abrasion of the raft surfaces. His eyes grew accustomed to the glare off the water, allowing him to spot fish and debris from considerable distances. Most importantly, his digestive system adjusted to his new diet of raw fish, seaweed, and the occasional seabird unfortunate enough to land within reach. But survival came at a terrible cost. Miguel's mental state continued to deteriorate as the isolation wore on. By his 4th month adrift, he was experiencing severe depression, paranoia, and increasingly vivid hallucinations. He began to believe that rescue ships were deliberately avoiding him, that there was some conspiracy to leave him stranded in the ocean. The worst moments came during the calm periods between storms, when the raft sat motionless on glassy seas that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The silence was absolute, except for the gentle lapping of water against the raft's hull. And in this silence, Miguel's mind conjured horrors that no external threat could match. He began seeing things in the water, massive shapes moving beneath the surface, faces of people he had known, ghostly vessels that vanished when he looked directly at them. Sometimes he was convinced that Carlos was swimming alongside the raft, just out of sight, calling for help. As his 7th month adrift began, Miguel made a discovery that would prove crucial to his survival. While attempting to catch a small fish that had taken refuge beneath the raft, he noticed that various forms of marine life had begun using his floating home as an artificial reef. Small fish gathered in the shade beneath the raft's hull, feeding on algae and barnacles that had begun growing on the rubber surface. These fish, in turn, attracted larger predators, creating a miniature ecosystem centered on Miguel's tiny craft. This discovery revolutionized his fishing technique. Instead of casting lines into the open ocean with little hope of success, Miguel learned to fish directly beneath the raft. He fashioned hooks from safety pins and other metal objects, using bits of previously caught fish as bait to lure his prey within reach. The increased protein intake probably saved his life. Though he remained severely malnourished, the regular supply of fresh fish provided essential nutrients and helped stabilize his rapidly declining physical condition. But the ocean had more lessons to teach. During his 8th month adrift, Miguel encountered his first major storm since losing Carlos. The tropical cyclone approached from the southeast, with winds exceeding 80 miles per hour and waves that towered 30 feet above the tiny raft. For 48 hours, Miguel fought for survival against nature's fury. The raft was tossed like a cork, frequently disappearing completely beneath massive walls of water. Several times, Miguel was certain the craft would be torn apart, leaving him to drown in the churning sea. But somehow, both he and the raft survived. When the storm finally passed, Miguel found himself in a part of the ocean he didn't recognize, with no reference points to indicate his location. The storm had driven him hundreds of miles from his previous position, further into the trackless waste of the Pacific. This storm marked a turning point in Miguel's psychological state. Having survived nature's ultimate test, he began to develop an almost mystical relationship with the ocean. He learned to read its moods, to anticipate its dangers, to find sustenance, and even comfort in its vast emptiness. He began talking to the sea as if it were a living entity, sometimes pleading for mercy, other times expressing gratitude for the fish it provided. This anthropomorphization of his environment helped combat the isolation, giving him someone or something to communicate with during the endless days. As his first year adrift drew to a close, Miguel had physically adapted to his harsh environment in ways that would have seemed impossible when his ordeal began. His skin had darkened to a deep bronze, providing natural protection against the sun's rays. His body had learned to function on minimal nutrition, operating at a baseline that would have been unsustainable for most people. But perhaps most remarkably, his mind had developed coping mechanisms that allowed him to maintain a tenuous grip on sanity. He created elaborate mental games and challenges, reciting poetry he had memorized as a child, constructing detailed plans for the restaurant he would open with Elena when he returned home, even composing songs about his experiences. The anniversary of his ordeal, September 12th, 2020, passed without fanfare. Miguel Mar,